My name's Norman Thatcher Sharp, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy here in Slovakia. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to another one of our ongoing face-to-face series of discussions that we hold in public around various topics of high interest in Slovak societies here. Tonight's theme is education. I probably don't need to explain to this crowd how the future of any society is based on its youth, and the key to empowering that youth and ensuring that they're able to compete in today's globally connected world is, of course, education, preparing those youth for the future. So I was very heartened to see, I think it was last week, that Comenius University cracked the top 500 list of universities in the world for the first time, and that was great, certainly. But one of the things I've noticed in the year and a half I've been here as I go around and talk to businesses, to young people, and to others, is a one common theme is concerns that people have about the education system in Slovakia. So we're going to explore that a little bit tonight. We were very pleased that we were able to schedule this during the visit of a distinguished U.S. university professor, Professor James Moliterno, who's a professor at the Washington and Lee University School of Law in America. While the U.S. certainly does not have all the answers in higher education, and particularly, I would say we have our own problems in the area of rising costs and accessibility to education. It's good to have Jim here to sort of provide a little bit of the U.S. context to this issue that a lot of countries most countries around the world are grappling with. Joining Professor Moliterno, we have three Slovaks who will each be able to give us some great contributions based on their perspectives. We have Miroslav Beblavý, who's a member of parliament and who's been a long time speaker on education. We have Renáta Králiková, who doesn't like it when I use the term expert to refer to her, but she is an expert on higher education at the Slovak Governance Institute. And we have Jozef Jurkovič, who's the director of the University Education section at the Education Ministry of Slovakia. And then, in order to make sure we have a good discussion tonight, we have a great moderator here, journalist Jan Glovičko. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jan. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So before we actually start about the quality of Slovak education, a technical remark, comment for you. So the discussion is going to be bilingual because there's a US guest, so should you need the interpreting, at the back of the room there are headsets for you, and the discussion is going to be interpreted into Slovak or into English. So let me welcome our guests once again. I'd like to thank you very much to all of you for accepting our invitation to this discussion about the quality of Slovak universities. I'd like to thank to the audience for their presence. From my perspective as a journalist, the topic of education in Slovakia is a major problem. It's a significant problem. It is not being tackled, and the quality is declining. And at the same time, it is a topic that somehow appears to be at the end of the list of the priority topics for this country. And this is illustrated by several indicators. For example, financing of schools. This is going to be discussed also tonight. So to open this, I believe it's quite important to summarize what's the status quo of Slovak universities, what's the status quo of Slovak schools. But before that, let me give you a short story to open the discussion. Let me remind you a personality that I very much value and who did a lot in the sphere of Slovak universities, and who Mr. Vladimir Šuchan, who ran for rector of the most valued Slovak university. He's now at the moment at a very high position in Brussels. And when he was running for this position, he offered a project. It was a Comenius university, and he offered this project to the senators of the university, and he compared the largest and oldest Slovak university to the Masaryk University in Brno, which actually swallows most of the Slovak students in the Czech Republic. or attracts most Slovak students in the Czech Republic. And he said that 20 years ago, the Masaryk University in Brno was at the level of a rural university, and in those 20 years it made such a huge progress that it is actually vying with the Charles University in Prague, which is #1 university in the Czech Republic. And he said that his goal was to make the communities university the same. He basically likened the Comenius University to this Brno University, and he said that all we need to do is to want, and we need the will to do that. And the first question for the analyst is, what's the status quo of the Slovak universities, and what prevents, for example, Slovak universities to follow the suit and become as successful as the university in Brno? So let's start with the ladies first. So Ms. Králiková. Well, thank you very much for invitation. I appreciate the chance to be here with you and share my opinions and ideas. Let me abuse this position, this opportunity, and let me start with a different perspective. You know, we just spoke about. It might be quite good to know where we actually went from and where we're going. So let me give you a couple of words. How we got to the situation in which we are today. So first of all, we need to realize that we are a country which is just like many other countries around. We're a post-communist country that brings a lot of that brings some heritage or tradition with it, and also within Czechoslovakia. Slovakia was not the more advanced part. We didn't have Charles University or Palacký University in Olomouc, so we had more difficult starting position. And when we're talking about this period of communism, you know, most support was given to natural sciences and technical sciences, which the purpose was, of course, to this vying between the East and West. We wanted to be the winners, and the humanities were quite neglected. You know, these scientists were often sent to blue-collar jobs, you know, away from universities, and this is one of the things that leaves its negative heritage in Slovakia. These 40 years of communism, you know, elite wasn't being built. And also in the natural science and technical sciences, professors didn't have so much contact with the advanced world, didn't have so much means and finance and funding to be able to keep up the step with the top leading scientists. So now we are in the year 1989, where the huge political change came, the first act on universities, which mainly was supposed to introduce autonomy of Slovak universities, or Czechoslovak universities at that time. So we basically gave over the universities to the hands of the academics, who started to manage universities to the best of their abilities. And again, historically, we know that especially the humanities and the people who were at the universities, the humanity subjects had their own history, and they were preparing the students. Then we had the era of Mečiarism, which was in the 90s, and this era was important from the perspective that, I'm not sure if some of you may remember, that universities at that time, and also my own alma mater, the University of Comenius, were unofficial the greatest enemies of the system, and Mečiar, who was the prime minister, actually established 3 new public universities, state-run universities outside Bratislava. It was in Trenčín, Banská Bystrica and Trnava, and this resulted, some of you may remember, resulted in a number of non-accredited programs, which again left us with a certain negative heritage. So when Minister Vtáčnik became the Minister of Education, he found a great number of students and their parents who, of course, were not willing to accept the fact, after years of studying, that their children will not receive graduations. So even though there was a declared attempt to do something about it, nothing was actually done. And at that same time, I think it was after 1996, where there was this small amendment of the Education Act, or University Education Act, that allowed schools to charge fees for external non-regular study. So this became basically a way how to allow some people to buy university degrees, and a grey zone was established. So this was the 90s, and then after the end of 90s, Minister Vtáčnik came, who prepared a new Act on Universities, and we needed to catch up with Europe because in classification. And there was new University Act that, for me, meant more or less, well, first of all, we needed to tackle accreditations, which the Act did. So all universities had to pass through accreditation process. It was a huge, complicated process. And the second thing was introduction of this large economic freedom, of economic liberty. It was quite relaxed, even when compared to other, even Western states. You know, the universities have huge liberty. They can do whatever they like with their property, etc., etc. So these were the main motives of the year 2002 when the reform came into force. And really, when you look at the year 1989, we had 64,000 university students. Then in 2008, we had 230,000 university students. So this huge growth, it was a huge growth from 1989 to 2008. But today, again, we see a decline in the number of students, decline of 25,000 compared to 2008. So in the year 2002, when the Act on Universities was passed, the number of students grew drastically. And the University Act actually allowed the establishing of private universities. The interpreter wishes to apologize. I have a problem with the signal.
But the effect was that the number of students on the external studies started to drop. So, in my opinion, where we are at the moment is that we were struggling with the problem of never resolving the number of private universities that occurred. We also have to remember that two other state universities were established, the Catholic one and Hungarian university, about 10 years ago. So, roughly, I would like to conclude one of the things that we're going through in terms of the quality of studies is the problem of the number of universities. It's just the sheer number that is a problem, but that's not only an issue of Slovakia. I don't think we are special in this. There are other countries dealing with this problem. And another issue is the quality of science, scientific research, and the number of scholars. I believe we do not have much stimulation for the scientists to work at universities. Thank you for this historical overview of the development of universities in Slovakia. And now I would like to hand it over to Mr. Beblavý. Maybe he will go more into politics because we've heard an expert viewpoint, and maybe now we can hear more about the political failures or achievements. I'm always fascinated how political and expert viewpoints are in contradiction. I don't think there is any contradiction there, and I will try to demonstrate why I think so. I will continue where Renáta ended, and I will be very academic for a while. Those of you who have some quantitative education know that regression means a method where on one hand you have variable which you want to explain, and on the other hand you have all the other variables which should help you to explain the first one. And from this viewpoint, the metaphoric regression of the status in Slovakia is that it is enough to take 3 variables and they will metaphorically explain 90% of the situation where we are at the moment, and none of them is a failure of political elites. First of all, we have to take the history of Slovakia, the length of elites in Slovakia and education of elites in Slovakia. I have to tell you a joke about a Russian oligarchy. He wants to buy a lawn, and when he looks at the lawn, it doesn't look like the British one, and then he complains that it doesn't look like it looks in Britain. So that's what the situation in Slovakia is like. Some universities were established at the beginning of the last century, and most of them were established after the Second World War. So they have quite a short history, first of all. And when I was in the United States, I read a book about Czechoslovakian educational system in between the two wars. I think it's the best book about our education. And it is shown there that in 1919 there was no academic elite in Slovakia, and after 20 years, it was in 1939, it still didn't exist. And it is proven that during the period between the two wars, 2,500 students graduated. It means a huge number, but today it's just the number of the students graduating from one university in 1 year. So in 1919, just very few students. In 1939, still very few. And the mass production of students only started after the Second World War. So that's the first factor. Renáta said once that when you compare private and state universities, that it's a mistaken viewpoint to look at the schools without looking at the time when they were established. You cannot just look at the number of students. You have to really see how long these universities have been around here, because many times politicians are just putting pressure on the existence and establishment of universities. So in this metaphorical regression, the first variable would be the age. Our knowledge-based economy is just very fresh, very young, only 60 or 70 years. The second factor is money. Everybody knows about this issue. And it is famous saying that you get what you pay for. Today in the morning, I was at a seminar which was very well organized, but it was organized by two ladies from the European Commission. But these ladies are very well paid, and if you have enough money, you can pay to have high-quality people. So if our universities and their professors and associate professors would be paid well, we would have more quality. And the third variable is temporary effects of fast expansion. Because the one effect is that when you expand very fast, you don't always get quality. But in Slovakia, if you get rid of someone who teaches at a university because of lacking quality, it would mean that you wouldn't have enough professors after a while, and you need to have professors in order for your university to have credit. So they are important commodity. So anyone from the top academic elite is leaving the university. They have to be soon replaced, and that's why not many people quit universities and not many people are being fired. So the massification only went one way. So we have too many students of humanities, and we have very few students and professors of microbiology and technical experts. We have at universities several professors who have been there during the socialist and communist times, and they've been members of the Communist Party, but they are still surviving at universities just because they're professors. So this is what expansion at any cost brought about. So my first conclusion is that you have to take into consideration these three variables, and then you're not surprised with the current status. I am not trying to make some excuses for the situation we have at the moment. I'm sure we could do better if we compare ourselves with Balkan countries. And you can be above the line in this regression formula, or you can be below the line. So if we want to do better, we need to invest more somewhere, either invest more money or to think what can we do, what dynamics we need at universities in order to get more quality out of the current status. Maybe some internationalization, increasing criteria, but we cannot expect that things will get better just on their own. That's my second statement. What I think is that the influence of the state and politics on the education is very limited. I believe the key results are limited because accreditation mechanism, which is one way of controlling, turned out to be inefficient, and there are very few cases where any Slovak university wouldn't get accreditation for something if they really tried hard enough. So whenever they tried hard enough, they could cheat and do whatever, but they've achieved it. So empirically, it is difficult to claim that quality control mechanism considerably changed the situation compared to a status where there would be just self-regulation. I don't think the result would be very different. And if we talk about things like financial stimuli, state does have more power there. These incentives were introduced 10 years ago, and they started to make more pressure on publication activities, and they started to raise the value of some type of experts who could bring about research projects, etc. So we could see some mild effect there, where state intervention could increase intra-university quality. So they could attract more money with their research. But overall, I'm afraid to say that if some... I'm not afraid to say that even if some chimpanzee was on the place of a minister of education, the situation would be very different. Slovak, Polish, and Czech economics had a huge gap between how many people received their diploma and graduated from economics compared to the real need. And that is reflected in the fact that even if the state did not pay for their studies, people were willing to pay for their diploma in order to have one. So maybe we could have been smarter. Countries like Estonia or Lithuania, they were definitely smarter. They've made less mistakes. But on the other hand, if we look at the situation in Poland, we could have done worse. And I'd like to finish with an anecdote. I teach at the University of Political Science, which is the youngest department, but it is highly ranked. The youngest department of the University of Comenius. So sometimes even the younger departments can do better than the older ones. So this is the highest quality faculty. We have some impressive colleagues. Some of them have been at Stanford University. Mrs. Radičová, our former prime minister, is teaching there. So these are people who publish in various international magazines. So I believe we do have quality there. Nonetheless, I've received emails from the university staff telling me that some types of book purchases have to be made through written requests, and the email was very pushy in what it was trying to achieve. And my conclusion was that if at this most progressive and most cost-efficient university it looks like this, how does it look like in those which aren't doing so well? So there are things which you can change quickly, especially if you have money to do it, but there are cultural things which are very difficult to change. For instance, the University of Management is trying to bring US standards, although it still has very conservative and old-fashioned way of doing most of the things. I will have to finish, I'm aware. I would just like to warn not to try and find quick solutions. I believe that policymakers should try to get rid of the C's, those or that type of education which is of the lowest quality. So the state should try and get rid of the worst performing parts of education. And the second thing we should focus on is the support of excellence, support of those places which are of international standards, and maybe audit every 5 years what is doing well and what is not. And having complex accreditation means so much bureaucracy and so much paperwork that I believe it's useless. So I think we should stop trying to work from scratch with every new government. So the state should really focus on getting rid of the worst 10–15% and try to support the excellent ones. I think that would really encourage more quality in our education. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a bit longer comment. So let me just tell you that this was really quite critical about the education system in general. So in practice, it seems that there are some special affairs that we journalists notice, and it seems that like students were, for example, willing to pay for the degrees, and this is the case of the Trenčín University, where we saw that there was a model set up or established, but that the teachers or the pedagogues actually had that they had a special source of income from selling degrees, and other schools or these fast lane diplomas or fast lane degrees There was the case of also of some top politicians, for example, Mr. Figel, etc., etc. Mr. Jurkovič, you work with the Ministry of Education for 10 years. You're director of University Education Section, so there's been quite a lot of criticism from the first two panelists. So how do you see the status quo of Slovak universities? Maybe we can turn the discussion and let's talk about the positive aspects of universities. Do you agree with what's been said, or were there things mentioned that which are not so true, or what do you think are the good and positive aspects about Slovak universities? Well, it's difficult to follow up on these two very extensive and information-filled comments. What I understand is that if I haven't been working for 10 years at the Ministry of Education, I was doing something else, that perhaps the results would be the same, maybe even better than they are now, which gives me requires a great courage to continue in the discussion. Well, I may agree with many things that's been said. I mean, the evaluation of the starting point and the historical discourse was correct. Perhaps I'll add a few comments. I think in 2002, there was an essential change of the system of the university education, also from the economic perspective. And we set up, or the processes were set up to manage this massification that you talked about. But the truth is that from various reasons, number of things that were tackled in 2002, there were so many things that they didn't receive institutional support by the central bodies like the ministry. So when the transformation of the economy, the system of funding, the accreditation system, financing of science, funding of science, as such, in terms of quality of education, the discussion started about some internal discourse about how the setting should, how setup should be like, and at least on paper, in 2003 we were doing quite fine. The criteria of accreditation already in 2003 required universities to have internal quality provision system, and after 10 years we are surprised that this is a new topic for faculties and universities, and it seems as if we were starting from scratch once again. And the second problem is this massification you mentioned. Formally, we basically divided the first, second and third grade, so the people who perhaps would never study a 5-year master study because there would be no capacity, today are getting a second degree university education. And universities were not motivated, and we failed to motivate them to ensure realistic bachelor degree. They would not make people to desire for a second degree, for master's degree. So I don't want to speak for too long because but let me talk about leadership, ethics and morals in academic sphere, which was partially mentioned in the previous comments. And another thing is that when universities are autonomous in a number of areas, they have a number of possibilities. Nevertheless, quite often the universities have some sort of need where as soon as problem appears, we need to contact the ministry or the minister, let him or her solve the problem. So there's unwillingness to take over the responsibility for themselves. I mean, I do understand that universities are financed from public sources, and even though there's been quite interesting decline in the public expenditures on education. However, universities have a number of opportunities to get further funding and to be active, but not many actually take advantage of these opportunities. I think that there are a number of best practices in Slovak universities. A number of collectives and leaders are active. They cooperate with the practice. They involve in research, and for example, people from mathematical physical faculty are in CERN in Geneva. It says a lot. And of course, these humanities, they're facing the problems that have been mentioned previously. But at least there's one faculty, which is a model faculty. But as far as I know, generally, the Catholic University has been mentioned, which is a I don't know. I'm not sure about the adjective, but there's been quite disrespect. A lot of disrespect from what I heard. You were saying about this Catholic university, but it is a young faculty, and there's a team of people who know how to do it. They're interested in it, and they have the internal momentum to get ahead. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on and let's put a question to our American guest, Professor Moliterno. Professor, from listening about the status quo of the Slovak universities, you have some experience. You've been in Slovakia for fourth time. You've been into Serbia, Georgia, Czech Republic. You know the region. What's your feeling? What's your feeling from the things that's been said about the status quo of Slovak universities, and what are your personal experiences from visiting these countries? You've been to Trnava University today, is that right?
Comenius today. I was at Trnava on my last visit, and Comenius today. So I want to start by thanking all of you for being here and inviting me to join this panel discussion tonight. I'm really privileged to be here. It is my fourth time in Slovakia. I'll come back as many times as I'm invited. I love it here very much. My wife loves it here very much. We've spent a good bit of time, as was indicated, in a number of different places as far as China and Thailand and Indonesia working with higher education. But as was pointed out, I've worked a good bit in Serbia, I've worked a good bit in Croatia, in Georgia, and a lot in Czech Republic as well. So I have some sense of the region, and some of what I'm hearing and learning so far in my visits to Slovakia sounds familiar from problems that I've encountered or discussions I've had in other places that are trying very hard to build their higher education system. And that's what's happening here, of course. The effort is to build a higher education system. I'll be happy to answer specific questions and talk more about the U.S. experience if people have particular things. I've been a professor for 32 years at some very fine American universities. And during that time, I've had opportunities to be a vice dean, an academic dean. I've had opportunities to be the president of what we call faculty assembly, which is close to what your faculty senate is. So I've had experience in a variety of different settings being responsible for the well-being of the institutions where I've worked. And what I want to focus on, though, is what I've learned in my work in Serbia and the Balkans generally, Georgia. I'll tell you a quick story that will give you the idea of what I've learned so far. So in Serbia, I was there on one occasion to consult with the academic dean of a law faculty. And our goal was to discuss what kind of policies and what kind of changes might need to be made on that law faculty to make it successful, more successful. And so I began our 1 hour. We had only 1 hour available together. I began our 1 hour by asking the vice dean what kind of problems he had. What could we work on? What kind of policies? And his answer was, I have a million problems. Everything is wrong. I need a new policy for everything. And I said, well, we have 1 hour. And in this 1 hour, let's start with your biggest problem. What is your biggest problem? His answer was, my biggest problem is that the students don't care about what's happening in the lectures. They're not interested. They're not listening. He said, even if you can imagine it, you could go to the back of some lecture halls at my university, he said, and you could find music playing, dancing, even students kissing in the back of the room, paying no attention whatsoever to what was going on. I was so amazed, and I realized immediately that I had no first impression of how I could help on this. So I did the normal thing that you would do under those circumstances. I said, well, what is your second biggest problem? He said his second biggest problem was that he had no real control over the professors. That they didn't come on time to teach, that they stopped the classes too early, that some days they were meant to appear for a class and they didn't appear, and on and on and on. He went, at this time, on about the professors. And now I understood what I could say to him. I said, my first comment is that your second biggest problem is actually your first. And your first problem is your second. And I said to him, until you are able to get your faculty to behave in a responsible way, a professional way, you will never get the students to take this institution seriously, and they will continue to behave exactly as they have. Everywhere I go that's trying to build, I'm actually encouraged by the comments I've heard so far tonight in a strange way. Everywhere I go where a country is trying to build its higher education system, I hear incredible, incredible criticism of the students. I hear that the students don't pay attention. I hear they don't work hard. I hear that they cheat, that they help each other cheat on exams, and so forth. My reaction to all of that has been that until the institution is a place that is worthy of their respect, they will continue to behave that way. And it's natural for them to continue to behave that way. What I've learned, especially in the Balkans, I've learned that the students have very low respect for the institution, for the higher education institution, the university. But they do love and have great admiration for their colleagues, for their fellow students. Their friendship is a higher value than any sort of loyalty to the institution. And so they balance what they should do with respect to helping a fellow student to cheat on an exam or to find a way around the requirements at the university. And they come to the conclusion that the greater good is to help their fellow student, not to follow the rules of the university. So I'm encouraged in a way that I am hearing criticisms of the university more than I am hearing criticisms of the students, because the first job has to be to make the university a place that is worthy of respect by the students. It has to be the first. Well, how do you do that? There are many things that need to be done, and we've heard about some of them already. Some of them involve money, more funding for universities, and without some reasonable level of funding, most things can't really go forward in making universities better. But universities need to have policies and practices that are followed, that are legitimate, that ensure that ethical treatment of students and faculty will occur. If they don't, you're not at the first step. You have to have these good, solid policies that are respected. The faculty needs to become dominated by people who care about their work. It needs to be dominated by faculty who have passion for their work with their students and their scholarship and their work in helping to govern their institution of higher learning. Only when the faculty is dominated by people who have passion for it and want it to work well, will the place begin to work better and the students begin to respect it and progress can be made. It takes a long time. This is not something that can be fixed very quickly. A culture of respect for the university and a culture of respect for the students has to be developed over time in order for this to work. The professors in particular, I've met with a number of young faculty members at Trnava. I've met a number of young faculty members or PhD students in the law faculty at Comenius just this afternoon. And they do care about their university. They do care about wanting to make it work better. And so I understand that at the moment, the faculty is not dominated by this younger group who has passion for making the place work better. But they will get more experience, they will get more power, they will get more respect, and over time, they can form a core of faculty, of professors, who are worthy of respect and make the institution worthy of respect. I said several times that a university needs to be dominated by professors who have passion for their work. I said that because I don't know anywhere on earth, including my university, which is a top 25 university in the United States. It's a wonderful university, very high quality. I don't know any university on earth, including mine, that doesn't have at least some faculty who are not doing a good job. Every place I've ever been, there are at least some faculty who don't care about teaching well, who have stopped thinking fresh thoughts that they can write about and produce scholarship. And so I believe that no matter how mature a higher education system becomes, there will always be some of these. But they need to be the minority. They need to be the ones who are marginal, out at the edge, and not the ones who are in charge and controlling policies inside the university. So one should never expect perfection. One should never expect everything to work perfectly well. But it is possible by building the faculty and concentrating on it first, and not the students, to build universities that are worthy of the public's respect, worthy of the students' respect, and that's how to grow a better higher education system.
Thank you very much.
I would actually like you to comment on what was said by Mr. Professor. He talked about enthusiastic people, he talked about ethics, and he talked about the fundamentals from which we can start to build universities back. And in order not to only dwell on the problem of attracting elites and then going back to the financial problem, I would like us to elaborate on this topic from a different viewpoint. So, Mrs. Králiková, what do you think? Where are those people who could move our universities forward? So let's not talk about money. It's not a problem of the Slovak universities not being able to pay well for high-quality people. I think it's the problem of micro and macro level. So it starts from the distribution of money to universities. Maybe you don't know that universities are one of the last to receive the money. So even people who didn't do anything after their PhDs, they have guaranteed salary, which is higher than most of the other people in the government sector. So let's not talk about money. Yes. So what Mr. Professor said is true, but universities all around the world work on the basis of peer review and peer selection. So the only way is that other professors tell you who is supposed to be a professor and who is to be a member of elite. So elites produce elites. And that is why it is important to talk about history and slow changes. Then, of course, the changes take long this way. And some dramatic changes from outside only took place when the regime changed. And the year 1948 was a bad one for Slovakia. And 1999 was a year where the political will wasn't really present. And it is quite easy to model the situation. If a percentage of quality people drops by a certain percentage, then the elites don't work anymore. So if the elites do not contain sufficient percentage of real elites, the actual elites, then they will only choose people like themselves. And then the system deteriorates. And that's what's happening in Slovakia and what has been happening for the past 25 years. Even if someone wanted to be an associate professor, for instance, the system is not very favorable for these people. These people find out that it's very difficult to get by and to go forward, and they find out that not much interest is around, and there is a lot of regulation. One of the changes that we've suggested with the former minister was that if you can even be a Nobel Prize winner, but you cannot still be a professor in Slovakia. You would still have to teach for 10 years in Slovakia to become a professor, just to get the status of a professor. We suggested with the former minister that people who fulfill scientific criteria for being professors should be professors, and they would get 5 years in order to finish some formal things. So today, even if you are a managing person at university, you cannot offer someone, even if they've had doctorate, you cannot offer them to be professors if they don't fulfill the formal criteria. So though we wanted to release the barriers, get rid of the barriers to recruit quality. And then there's a problem of the motivation to recruit quality. One of the last things that the governments did was that they put a little pressure on getting academic quality. So today, if I have I have a golden cap saying that I bring money to university. This didn't exist 50 years ago. And today I can see how people are changing their viewpoints over those at university which bring money to universities. So the quality people should also have financial quality. They should also be the ones to bring money to university, so that there is motivation to have you as a quality, as an elite. And we also need to bring back the brains. When we talked about the Baltic countries, I think what they did is that they brought back their expatriates and they started to reproduce the elites. And that is not happening in Slovakia. I remember the times when around the world there would be great Slovak minds all around the world who didn't want to come back and never came back. I was the only one who studied abroad and actually came back to work in Slovakia. So we should try and invent ways how to bring these people back. Let's buy these Nobel Prize winners. We need to buy 500 people with postgraduate doctorates, and we need them to come back here and to work in Slovakia. It's a matter of priorities. I think it's a problem of political system and electorate that we prefer the huge, big marketing solutions. I cannot imagine I can imagine at the moment that the minister would be very famous if he brought some Nobel Prize winner to Slovakia, and he would be less popular for finding the solution how to draw back.
Which is the key building block as a people. And I think that it hasn't been mentioned, but I work. I'm doing a PhD on the Central European University in Hungary, which is an American-based university, actually, or American origin. If you ask me if I want to return or I do not want to return, and I'm not talking about specifically about myself, but my type of people. But one of the things that I encounter is, well, the overall conditions. If you motivate the people only by money, wage, which you can't always guarantee, especially when we still, to a great degree, depend on public resources. Another important factor is the conditions of research, which is very poor in Slovakia, and it hasn't been mentioned yet. This is one of the key things that needs to be changed. For example, yesterday I checked figures about the grant support, funding of research, because this is what really interests you at university besides teaching. I mean, you don't only want to teach, but you want to extend your research, and there are very poor conditions for that in Slovakia. And if you don't have these conditions, and it's not only that there's no money for that, but even the money that is here is used not very effectively. Miro made a very useful thing in the summer when he pointed out how minister allocates funding for support of investments in stimuli, so stimuli for applied research, and he put more than 10 million euro in it, and the Agency for Science and Research, and this 10 million euro concern 5 people for very useless projects. And if you compare it with the budget of Agency for Research and Science that supports 600 projects perhaps a year, realistically, we are getting money realistically, right? Yes, but without. So you said leads and people you want to attract, and now you talk about money. Well, okay, one thing is that we need to talk about science, because this is what universities are about. And the second point is that it's not just that there is no money. There is some money, but it's spent ineffectively. I'm not talking about structural funds, EU structural funds. So these are other areas where we need to focus on. And yet another thing that would help in HR is internationalization, but not only in sense of let me put it a different way. I mean, I'm not just a person who tries to attract people back to Slovakia, because at a certain age people tend to leave the country. But I think we need to try to attract people from third countries, not only Western Europe, And again, not the Nobel Prize winners, but just potential people who have potential, who can potentially develop. And basically we are putting them away today. We treat everyone like a terrorist, It's really hard for people from third countries, not from the West, to come over here. And there's another thing that could help. And exactly the Faculty of Social and Economic Sciences is relatively successful. Is a result of the fact that there are some people with foreign experience, that have experience with other cultures that can pass on. And I checked the figures of how many top teams we have in ARA, These people were doing this for hard sciences, like natural sciences, technical sciences. There are approximately 630 people who are comparable to the West, or the global world level. And out of these 630, 300 are at university. Out of the total of 10,000 pedagogues. So we can also talk about ethics. And there's another important area in relation to building of culture. We both have, with Miro, rich experience, because we often talked about this area, which is very important, because people who, whistleblowers who talk about problematic points in ethics, or deceiving, or they don't have support in the system. They don't have support at these universities, just because there's not the very healthy setup of self-government that we came up with in 1989, where it was like the key thing. and they simultaneously don't have support with the Ministry of Education, where I believe it would be quite convenient to look at the increasing the quality of controlling job, supervision job. You know, it's a very specific thing. So we also need to deal with this. So we need to look at science. We need to support internationalization. We need to talk about money, of course, not just about paying more money, but how to use the money that we have effectively. And I believe today is a quite good opportunity, because, as I said, that there's a major decline in the number of students. You know, between 2008 and today, we have 25,000 less students, and the trend seems to be continuing. So we have some blown-up capacities, and maybe it's the right time to check. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, we need to move on, but if these students, well, you said that there's declining number of students, but aren't these students just leaving for the Czech Republic? Because already today in the Czech Republic you have thousands of students from Slovakia. No, I don't think so. No, these 25,000 since I've been dealing with the issues of universities, which is 15 years, you've always had around 25,000 Slovak students in the Czech Republic. It's a demographic development. There's not much to do with what I've been saying, and this is definitely going to continue for some years. And we still have some years to see approximately 25,000 Slovaks studying in the Czech Republic. But still, I believe that we have the right time for concentrating the capacities and focus on quality. Okay, now the question for the Ministry of Education. Do you agree with what's been said? Are these the major pillars that the Ministry of Education is going to put focus on or emphasis on? Or do you have a different perspective on some of the priorities that we mentioned here? Well, I have the right to choose now which are the priorities, right? Well, let me return to what Mr. Beblavý said previously. I agree with the fact that people are key. I see two levels here. First is a systemic level, and since 2002 we have a selection procedure system combined with the degrees, but you know, we have created some systemic conditions to choose the best people for the given position. The fact is that from a number of reasons there are not great many quality people applying for these jobs, because universities don't attract these people, or maybe don't even look hard to get these people. We have the official table for wages, and again the advantage is that if the government or the ministry gives you low levels of official wages, the university can take a different measure and increase that. But you know, these things are in the game. If this is politically viable, that's a question that remains to be answered, because the pressure from the academic senates and the trade unions is very hard. But hopefully we will succeed in this. But what I think is key, and Renáta has opened this, the topic, is the system of management, and not just management of the universities, and not just academic self-government, but what is not discussed enough, the relationship between the state and the universities, or the ministry and the public universities. Sometimes these universities feel the need that everything has to be tackled through the ministry, but on the other hand, we don't want to play the game with them, like we are trying to set up the rules at the moment, but we need to say that the public interest somehow is not clearly defined. I'm not sure what was the question, but solution is that we need to change this system of management, a system of self-government, academic self-government, and simultaneously we need to put money in that. What Renáta said, yes, of course, the number of students is falling, but you know, what happened now is that there was 20 million less from the state budget for universities, and if the number of students will continue to decline, the question is, if we continue, I mean, less students requires less funding. Well, that's the point I was trying to make, that we should take advantage of the situation that the funding should not be reduced, even though the number of students is falling. But yes, okay, you know, but the budget of the ministry is not actually approved by the Ministry of Education, it's the Ministry of Finance, you know, so. Okay, so the political motivation is required, right? Is that what you're trying to say? Yes, well, and the professor wished to react, so maybe I add the question, how do you see at this moment in relation to the United States, is really the academic self-government so important? Because I mean, it seems like academic senates are protecting, or they're refusing the change. So is there any remedy to make the academic senate not resist the change?
That depends on who's on your academic senate, and obviously the way to make an academic senate more open to change is to give the faculty, the professors, the incentive to change, the incentive to do better, the incentive to make the place work better. What I mostly want to say, we've been talking a lot about money, and we've been talking about how unattractive some people think that the Slovak universities are to be a professor. Very poor research support, as we've heard about, non-competitive salaries, a level, we've heard about whistleblowers, and obviously whistleblowers become whistleblowers because there is some level of corruption involved, and people buying degrees and things like that we've heard about. What I want to say is that the experience of the United States, for sure, and some other countries too, is that the investment in higher education is a very good investment. A society, a country can put its money in many different places, and we've heard that there is some money, maybe not enough, maybe not spent well, but a society needs to invest in higher education, because the better educated its young people are, the more likely it will be that companies, pharmaceutical companies, research companies, companies that make sophisticated products that need highly trained workers and highly trained professional people to do the kind of work that those companies do and the products that they make, they will come if the students are here. If the people are being educated to a high enough level that they can do the kind of work that sophisticated companies and organizations do, that's how you attract them. And when you attract those kind of institutions, suddenly there is more money available to spend on more things. So education, higher education in particular, though it obviously has to follow a good primary and secondary education, but investment of money in higher education has proven to be, time after time, in place after place, has proven to be well-spent money. Money that actually raises the standard of living of the country, raises the standard of living of its people, and allows for progress and greater outside investment to come to a country. And so I understand that money is not easy to come by these days, anywhere. It's very difficult. So I'm not suggesting that all of a sudden all of the money be put into higher education. It can't be done. But the money that is invested, if it's invested at a proper level, pays dividends back for the society. And so we shouldn't think of a sort of investment amount that is triggered by the number of students or anything like that. It's got to be an investment amount that will produce excellence, that will bring people here who want to be excellent in teaching the students, and will raise the level of research that's done, and will motivate the students to do better work as they go through their higher education. It will pay off for the society. That's a good investment.
Thank you very much. I think we can go on to the second part of our discussion, where we would like to give an opportunity to our audience. If you have any questions, you can post them now. Hello, Peter Rusniak. I manage the Center of North American Studies, and I'd like to shortly comment on what was said. But my opinions are just my opinions. I do not represent economic university where I teach. The topic of our discussion was how to improve the quality of our universities. So let's narrow down our discussion and let's try to go back to how things can be done. Let's start with the realistic picture of the situation in Slovakia. Let's start with 2 or 3 suggestions. First, I believe it's very unfortunate if universities work with people to whom they said, if you are an assistant teacher, you also have to teach, you have to do research and publish, etc., etc. The ability to teach and the ability to do research are 2 different human skills. So seeking people who are completely capable of doing both things is a miracle. For a concrete job, you need concrete skills and abilities. So this way, I'd like to appeal to our ministry, if they are going to amend the legislation, let's try and see whether it would not work better to have a category of teachers and category of researchers, and then something in between, maybe, because now we only work with something in between. From my viewpoint, I think this is very realistic. This can be achieved, and in terms of budget, it doesn't cost you anything. Second thing we should all think about is management of universities. I think for the future of universities, we know that elites reproduce elites, and in Slovak schools, elites do not like to have other elites come in their way because they feel jeopardized by other elites. So if one day there are elections to the boards, to the Senate, what do we expect in terms of managerial qualities from these people? If you are to be a rector at the university, do you need to have a professor's title, or do you need someone who can manage the school well? Because if we go back to business, people from business choose their leaders by how capable are these people to manage the companies. So I think we should expect the same to happen at universities. And as we mentioned, that money isn't the issue. Well, money definitely is the issue everywhere. But if we poured more money into universities, I believe students should have chance to select who should be teaching them and who shouldn't. I didn't want to say that money is no issue. I just didn't want us to only talk about money as an issue. Now, short response. Can we start here? I'd like to say a few things. First of all, universities can have lecturers today, and they will only teach. So there is this position existing at the moment. Lecturer is not a full-time employee. Okay, it's a legitimate position, and of course they should not be lecturing. And there is also a position of a researcher who might not teach. But if you're an assistant, then you are expected, sure, to be also teaching and doing research. And when it comes to management, we are slowly starting to work on the amendment of the legislation, and this is the biggest issue for us. And to be completely honest, we don't really know at the moment what to do with it. At the moment, it is not required by legislation that a rector must be a professor. A rector can be anyone who has been a manager, for instance, in a business sector. But there must be a candidate of that kind, first of all. Mr. Schucha, I think he worked abroad somewhere, so this was an example of someone from outside the university environment who was a candidate. And the question is whether the academic senate should choose a rector and who should be in the academic senate and what should be their competencies. So that is a tricky question. And it also depends on the lobby and so forth. So first of all, we need to come with some very decent proposal, and to be honest, we don't know at the moment what to suggest in order to cater for the needs of the public and also to satisfy the students.
I just have a couple of brief comments about what the question was. First, I'll mention that at most U.S. universities, the faculty, the professors, do not actually decide who will be the president, the rector. They don't. There is an independent board of very sophisticated, very successful people who are trustees, if you will, to the university. And although the faculty gets to make recommendations about who should be hired as the president, the manager, it's the board of trustees that hires that person. And it is quite common for there to be someone who is a professor at another university who becomes a president or a rector, but they are the people who have the management skills as well. They are the people who have had positions or had experience in their lives of managing some kind of enterprise and success at it. So we don't have a system in which the professors get to choose the leader of the university.
Lucky you.
Yeah, okay. So that's one point from our perspective. I will say that the argument that there should be teachers and then there should be researchers is a very powerful one, and it's one that is made in the United States quite a lot. But I have to say that in my many years, I have certainly seen some of the greatest researchers, some of the greatest scholars who were terrible teachers. So I agree with that. But I have also never encountered someone who remained a good teacher for a career. They might have started as a good teacher. They might be dynamic. They might be a good lecturer. But they don't remain a good teacher unless they are also thinking at the edge of their field and doing research and continuing to look at how things are developing in their field. So I haven't met that person yet. I've met young people who are good teachers and don't do research, but they don't seem to stay good teachers for a career. So that's at least been my experience with the teacher-scholar aspect of it.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I meant something like that. The thing is that here, public universities require that once you are hired as an assistant professor to the faculty, you have to, by your agreement with the school, you have to do both research and both teaching as such.
We do too.
And there, I see that as a very
we do too. We can't gain advancement unless, I'm sorry. We do as well. So we cannot gain advancement and promotions unless we do both well, unless we teach well and do research well. And yes, there are people who manage to get advancement when they're not as good at one as they should be, but that is at least the written policy and the requirement that you do research and you teach well. So.
Let me now break the first rule of politics, and I'll tell you things that you will not like. but I have also second career besides politics. First thing I'll tell you is that you're from a university where the problem is not in selection, the problem is in motivation. Let me give you an example. You have a rector who is clearly a very good manager. The question is, what is his motivation? What does it mean to be a good manager? Being a good manager means today that you know to manage things with the ministry, with the government, you know how to block things that you don't like or support changes that you do like and satisfy the strongest interests inside the university, and you guard the image of the university so that it doesn't is harmed too much. Your rector, Mr. Sivak, is excellent in all these things, and if you define good management like this, then he's doing a great job. He's the vice president of the rectors conference. Everything that they don't like, they manage to block. You know, economic university is not changed, which is of course a very good thing for most people who work there. Okay, not all of them, but clearly a majority likes that. You know, the stakeholders are satisfied. You know, if there was an independent board, you know, okay, let me tell you, we have some boards. I've been a member of one board. And Mr. Kolesik was also a member of the board. It's a university, communist university, appointed by the Minister of Education. So we have to be very careful with boards, because, you know, if you take a look at the composition of these boards, I wouldn't give them too much authority, you know, meaning looking at the people who are there. But it's a question of motivation. If your rector, Mr. Sivak, was motivated to make the economic university an internationally comparable economic school, I'm sure he could do that. But he's not motivated to do that. He's motivated to do the things that I've just described previously. And the second thing is about the science versus research versus teaching. You know, economic university in most of its sections is a business school. It's not even an economic. It's not an economic school. It's a business school. And in business, maybe these American business schools are really trying hard, but there's not much research going on. And if it is, then it's not so important for these schools. So in business schools, what is much more important is how good teachers you have, because, you know, research is not the most important thing at such a school. But let me put this aside, where I basically support you, but in most other things, most other university education, I agree with most of what Professor said. If you're not at the frontier of knowledge, I mean, if you teach the first graders, or, you know, 101 lessons, that's something else. But if you want to teach third or fourth or fifth grades, and you're not at the frontier of knowledge, and you're not really keeping fresh thinking, you're not going to do it well. I mean, the fact that you do it doesn't guarantee that you're an expert. I mean, and I agree that if you're a top scientist, it says nothing about the quality of teaching. But I agree with what Professor says. If you're not a good scientist and you're teaching in an area which is a science or has a accumulated body of knowledge, then I'll be quite afraid to let these people teach for a longer time without trying to do research or trying to do science. What I'd rather look at is how to push these people who are more science-oriented, how to learn them to teach. Teach them to teach. And I've been teaching for 14 years. I can tell you, no one was born wise. You know, and the problem is that there's no push, there's no drive in Slovakia. No one forces you, or no one drives you to be a better teacher. And I'm sure that these people that you are disappointed with could be great teachers if they were pushed and driven. But there was no concentrated effort of any sort of management of any school, any university to do this. So the question again is, why management is not motivated to do that? Maybe because students don't complain. Maybe students don't push, even though that they have certain share of their Senate chairs. But I haven't heard anyone saying, like, let's do evaluation of quality of teaching. We have this and this methodology in place, and now we'd like you, the management, do something. I've never heard anything like that, and I'm not trying to criticize, but I'd rather say that this is something where I have to push. And if we succeed in this, I'll show you that if your current director had real motivations, we'll be very surprised how great the school would be. Okay, maybe they will be facing a different future. And my last comment to what's been said. You mentioned stakeholders, but we must not forget that the most important stakeholders of these public schools are students, even though they still don't pay. But if you look at them as clients, of someone who's getting something, or perhaps buying something, not directly, but indirectly and through taxes, etc., then we might adopt a different perspective, because most stakeholders seem to be satisfied. But the mass is not satisfied with the quality of what they're getting. I'm not only talking about our school, I'm talking about the mass of university students in general. Thank you very much. Maybe there's a space for a student to comment, someone from the university, from the other side of the barricade. One short remark, comment. You appealed for the ministry to write something somewhere. One of the problems is if you look at the University Act, we have 190 articles, I think, and one of the things that would be very useful if there was much less written in legislation. We should rather look at the outputs, deliverables, and not trying to regulate everything, starting with who's supposed to be giving dissertation thesis to the PhD graduates, and what's the the testing for PhD studies. This is very different for very different sciences or very different subjects, and I believe that we should do it quite the other way around. Let's take a look at what we want the universities to do, and let's dictate them less. How we at the ministry believe it should look like. I do realize the problem that people like to be dictated. People like to have the things on paper, following the rules. But freedom is a very difficult thing to execute, and it's very important. Next question, please. Veronika Volčková, good evening. I'm not a student really, but for 10 to 15 years I work in informal education. I work with young people, and exactly in this area, in this discussion, I was very puzzled. But in the past couple of years, so in the past hour and a half, we've heard about students in 5 sentences at the most. But I believe that the whole discussion, and this is perhaps a rebuke to the organizers, we're missing the student element here in the panel. There are no representation of the people whom we're talking about all the time. I mean, only now you've mentioned that the arc lines in the whole discussion are students. And this is perhaps symptomatic of the whole problem to a certain extent. The problem of our universities, that we have the feeling that we know the best. Of the administrators, the people at the ministry, the consultants in various institutions and institutes, they think they know the best. I'm at the moment a student as well. Okay, sure. We think that we know, that we think that we do have the recipes, but in fact, students are not the student parliaments and student senates. We have these formal structures that theoretically should make sure that the most important stakeholders, the students, have their say. But in fact, you still have these people in these senates. They get into these senates. They sort of have this way of thinking very similar to the management, to the academic senate. And universities, most of them, unfortunately push the activity of university students who like to do something not related to the teaching at the school facility. We tried to start up with we wanted to start a number of programs, and just putting the posters requires the agreement of the rector. Just putting a poster on the wall, and these are totally primitive things. These are essential PR things that would help students to start living a life at these universities, to attract these students to the university, to feel the link, to be a part of this university and respect the university more. So I personally think that one of the biggest problems is that students are not taken as proper stakeholders in the whole problem. They are not informally involved. Formally, yes, they are, but informally, they're not involved to the solution of this problem, and this needs to be changed, whether at the formal or informal level.
Thank you for your question or observation. I really am a student at the moment. I liked your insight, because I have double experience from being part of formal structures, and I was also a chairwoman of the Students' Council. And one of the things that bother me right now is that we encouraged the current situation to occur, to exist. Today, when I'm in a different environment, I can see that the role of students is much greater, and this formal representation, in a way, is useless because, in fact, students do not have much chance to intervene and to control things. So I dare to say that even though I'm one of the authors of the current status, and I know it's also my mistake, therefore, I don't think this is what students need at the moment. It's more about teachers, and the self-governing system is really more about the power of teachers and management of schools. Students do not have much to say. The difficult part of it is how to change it, how to change the approach to a student-centered one. Students aren't there for the teachers. Teachers are there for the students. I know it may sound trivial, but we didn't manage to make it come true. So it is related to the topic of changing the management, and we should start to leave the system in which all the interests have to be represented. We should focus more on the contents, and we should encourage students to come up with their activities and initiatives. They should be able to say what classes they like, what teachers they like. We need to say that at Comenius University we didn't have any problem with student activity, so it definitely depends on the management. So it's about people too. We did have organized a lot of our extracurricular activities, so I believe it's about us. Students should be more active and they should fight for their rights. I don't know what your problem was with Discussion Club, but I don't think there really wasn't a chance to do things if people wanted to. I will have to apologize because I will have to leave to do my parental duties. I don't really believe in peak associations because it doesn't work in Slovakia anywhere. Maybe when Renáta was chairwoman it did work, but that's an exception we cannot build on. Today's chairwoman is a woman again, and I think she didn't do any good job after she gained a well-paid job. So I'm skeptical about it. If the power of students could work, it's on the lowest level. So I don't think the centralization is a good effort. What I believe we need is a system that supports decentralized systems. That's good for teachers as well as for students. And there, I think people are willing to engage in some activity. So if we want to talk about students' participation in management, it should be on the lowest level. It should be on the level of their department where they study. They couldn't care less about the management and university level. The second important thing is that if you want to control something or influence something at university, you can influence what you participate in. And emerit professor from one US school said in one famous article that how the university changes from a regular one to elite university, you also change your students. So it changes from the students who were just regular students to the excellent ones. The truth says that it works in France and it works in any country. So expecting that everybody from 220 people will engage into some activities is a dream. That will not come true. So what is important in Slovakia is how to strengthen the competitive environment. The trouble often is that people that it should be easy for the students to transfer from one university to the other, because it often happens at universities that they are not allowing students to transfer to another university. They delay their bachelor certificates release in order for them to be to have it very difficult to go over to another university. But otherwise, I believe it's about students. And the last thing we need to mention is about a student being a client. On one hand, students are choosing schools and the power of teachers over the students have to be present. So it's like with doctor, you are a client, but it's not like when you buy tangerines on the market. So there has to be a balance in this relationship. So you depend on the teacher, and the teachers should give you some knowledge, and they should not abuse their position. So it's not a standard client relationship. And where I teach, we had anonymous questionnaire among students, and they said that students have no problem with trusting us. They believed we behave decently and that we are creditworthy. Despite that, there was a large percentage of students who maximize diploma for minimum investment. It's not all of them, but I believe it's about 50% of the student body. So we need to say that even if the environment is set optimum, there are students who just need their diploma, they need certificate, and they don't really care on what course or what they learn. And you need to work with that if you have power over them. You want students to fight against those teachers who don't teach well, but on the other hand, teachers need to have power over the students. So that's a challenge that you need to work around.
So I'm going to have a couple of comments in response to the last question, and actually the question before that are going to sound completely, totally outside of everything we've been talking about so far tonight. I was prompted to think about this by the last question about the student's stake in the university and their role in the university. And I was also prompted to think about this because of the questions about the rector and the job of the head of the university. So in the US, I'll just say a couple things. How many of you have been at a US university? A good number of you, yes, okay. You saw that the entire neighborhood around that American university is filled with shops selling t-shirts, selling hats, selling figurines, selling little memorabilia items that are emblazoned with the name of the university and with the colors scheme that university uses. This actually builds over time a relationship between the students and their university, and even more importantly perhaps, between the graduates of that school and that university. And that relationship, strangely enough, it comes from t-shirts, it comes from football teams, It comes from many sources like that, I realize, and it sounds strange for us to talk about it, but they developed a relationship with that university. That means a couple of things, and I'll get to the record in 1 second. First of all, it means actually that the university operates on some level as a business. It brings in money for those items that are sold to people, parents of students, people who are from that part of the country who want to have a sort of affiliation with that university. It raises money for the university. Money doesn't all have to come from the government. Second thing that happens is that one of the major jobs and one of the ways that they're evaluated, of the rector, of the president of the university, is raising money, generating gifts to the university. And a very substantial part of those gifts come from the graduates of that university who are still wearing the t-shirts 50 years later of that university. It is an important part of every university to develop a long-term love relationship with their students and the graduates of that school. And so they develop a pride, and university presidents, yes, they're hired because they're good managers, but they are also hired because they are good fundraisers. They are people who can generate funds to make the research opportunities for the professors, to raise the salaries of the professors to competitive levels, to make the buildings into places that people enjoy being in. And so, again, this is kind of completely outside of the box that we've been talking about tonight. But one of the big parts of a university is to have people whose job it is to raise money for that university. And a lot of the money that gets raised, not all of it, a lot of the money gets raised because of this loyalty and love relationship that is nurtured with the students while they're there and with them after they graduate. The last small point I'll say about this is that we also evaluate the success of a university president and the success of the faculty by outputs. In part, we evaluate it by outputs. How many of the students who start at that university get a degree? How many of the students who graduate get jobs? What is the level of income of the people who graduate from that university? Do they pass the professional exams in law or medicine or whatever is the field that might have professional degrees? We measure and rank and praise universities in part because of what they produce, what walks out the door at the end of the experience, and how successful their graduates are. And so measuring outputs and praising the success of outputs is also a part of building a university system.
Thank you very much for the insight, and I can only commend that this system of support in the United States works very well, and even the Slovak graduates actually support their schools. For example, in Professor Jan Velček, who emigrated in 1960s in the United States, and at the New York University, he did his research at the New York universities, and he earned a great deal of money, and he became a donor to the New York University later on. So let's hope we find many of such similar donors in the future. So there's space for more questions. Michal Seda, good evening. I work in SAIA, Slovak Academy and Information Agency. We deal with we deal with a lot with mobility of human resources. And what's been said, well, I do not cast doubt on the role of students in the process, but it really is important. What's the status quo? What's the condition of the university, and whether the universities are ready to deal with the students, and the change of thinking in the academic environment from one generation to another. You know, this is how new models are being looked for. And the problem is that after 1989, there was a generation gap that occurred in the Slovak academic environment, the generation of the 50-year-olds who could have stayed in universities, they left for private sector, and now there are new, let's say young, I mean people in their 30s and 40s, who somehow try to follow up on what's been missing. They try to replace the missing link, you know. And you've mentioned that the possibility of increasing the attractiveness of our universities for foreigners, whether it's the Slovak expats or simply foreigners. But there are two problems here. First of them, for third-party expats, we're closing ourselves in terms of languages. You know, big countries like Germany or France, they have no problem because German and French are global languages. But all smaller countries followed suit, and they have English as a standard teaching language, or perhaps other languages in English. But in Slovakia, we close ourselves because we said studying in Slovak will be free, and studying in another language will be charged. So automatically, everybody will go to Slovak. We will study in Slovak because it's free. So the foreign pedagogues who would like to lecture here, they won't be learning Slovak to lecture here, you know. And the second problem is attracting these Slovaks who are abroad, who perhaps graduated good universities abroad, but we're not really trying to attract them back. The continuity in these various policies is non-existent because always someone comes up with a model for large scholarships for researchers, graduates of really great universities, but in the end, money is not found, the programs are not realized or executed, and it dies out. But there are always money found for different scholarships, and it's, for example, the Stefanik program. I have to mention this. We administered it for 2 times. It was revived for 2 times. The idea was to get people from quality universities to work for the state administration, for the state. We found approximately 20 scholars in the first stage. In the second stage, just 3, and now we're renewing the program again. And from all the graduates who went through this program, no one actually started working in public administration. Or, okay, I mean minority, let's say that minority did. But really, those who were supposed to start working at these ministries were not given the job because of the change of the policy. And it was not the problem of these people who took the scholarships, but if we said that this number would be bound to return to a university with these 300 that you, Renáta, mentioned, having 300 top people, these 30 would be 1 in 10. So basically the increased number. So it would be, in other words, it would be much greater effect like to invest in this and trying to put the money in the state administration body where it can end up just like it did with a couple of past waves. So we need to find the models in financing, what is effective, what is really worth investing, and not invest in state administration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadak. Thank you for observation. We are coming close to the end of discussion, so maybe 2 or 3 more questions. I'm Peter Rosiniak, senior. I am the father of the previous speaker. I have one big topic, so please bear with me. I think we're going around and around one issue. I will tell you my personal story. When I graduated, I decided that at one point in my career, I will end my job and I will go to university and teach. That's what I did. After 20 years of working in the business or for the government, I went to teach at the university. I believed that I've had enough experience, theoretical and practical, to be able to do this job. So externally, I studied to get my PhD, and I went to the big academic world. I was 48 at that point. After 8 years, I left academic sphere because the work attacked my health. I was completely disappointed with the situation at our universities. And that's because when I came to the university, my salary was 3 times smaller than I've earned before. Despite that, I wanted to do my job. I liked working with students, but nevertheless, I had to leave after 8 years. In my opinion, the basic problem of Slovak universities is a system. I'm afraid it's a pity that Mr. Beblavý had to leave. I agreed with everything he said today. When I met him first time, we didn't like each other, but I appreciate that he has grown and he thinks realistically now. So the basic problem of our universities is bad accreditation system, and as a result of that, we prefer quantity to quality in everything. We are a very small country and we have enormous number of universities. It's not about how many people have degrees in Slovakia, it's about how many people who are educated on all stages, because we need people to be educated from other stages of education too. Please, could you formulate a question so that we can get panelists to answer? My question was concerning teachers and scientists. So, when we talk about science, what do you mean? Because if someone wants to survive at university, the science is always the same. It is being judged in the same way, and it's being evaluated in the same way. It's being rated in the same way. If you work on a textbook for 2 or 3 years, you get 1 or 2 grades in your evaluation. So maybe this is a question also to...
And there are some American universities where there is a chart, and it says how many papers has this professor published, and you have to do a certain number to achieve the next rank. I don't like those systems at American universities. I very much prefer systems like we have at my university, where to get the promotion, your work is sent to other experts in your field all over the country. The best people we can find who will look at your work as a professor, your research, your documents, and evaluate it and say, is it good? And we don't worry so much about how many papers somebody has. We worry about the quality of those papers. And I prefer that kind of system. I think that's part of what you were criticizing. I'm not positive, but I think that's part of what you were criticizing. So I certainly prefer systems in which quality matters more than quantity. And there are American universities with both kind of systems, though I think the better universities care about quality more than they care about quantity.
Thank you very much. The very last question, it's after 8 already. Okay, no more questions. Okay, in that case, I'd like to thank you very much. I'd like to thank to all our panelists. I'd like to thank to Renáta Králiková from the Institution for Well-Governed Society. I'd like to thank to James Moliterno, the Professor of Law from the United States. And And I'd like to thank to Mr. Jurkovič from the Ministry of Education. I apologize, I'm tired. I'd like to thank to all of you for coming tonight, for being our audience and being active. And I hope that you will come to our next discussions.